Hello and welcome to Winter Disco Tabletop Gaming. I think it's time we started to talk about the old world. I don't believe that I've done any videos on Warhammer The Old World on this channel. I'm pretty sure I haven't. It's something that has been announced. Who knows when it's coming out? We really know not a lot about it, but we do get some more Q&A, just a couple of questions answered because there's been a lot of rumors, a lot of speculation. But let's start with what is Warhammer The Old World. It is a new rank and file 28mm or 32mm scale wargame that is set, I guess, several hundred years before the end times or before the, I guess it was 8th edition or 9th edition Warhammer Fantasy Battles, which if you were around at the time was the end time just destroyed the world and Age of Sigmar was born. So now we're in 3rd edition Age of Sigmar. If you were around, there was a big uproar about the end times and destroying Warhammer Fantasy Battles. It was a big thing. It was very contentious, a very bold move. But I think we can look back at it now and say it was the right decision at the time. Warhammer Fantasy Battles wasn't selling that well. People were really just holding onto the models that they had and they weren't buying anything else. This is just purely from what I recall from the time and what I've heard since then. It made sense that they needed to revamp everything. And there was also intellectual property things. They really wanted to establish their own IP, which is what they did, which is why things like Orcs turn into Orcs. There has always been this attachment to Warhammer Fantasy Battles and the old world that we're calling it now. So this project came up and I'm like, yes, super excited. I'm very excited for it. I think most people were, but there were so many questions around it and there was a lot of rumors going around because we didn't have any information. That's what they've put this article out for. We have a whole bunch of new information that we can go on. So let's look at these questions and we'll get a better idea of what to expect. So bases, square or round? Answer is pretty clear, it's definitely square. I would have been very surprised if they went with the round bases. If they went with round bases and individual models, this game would have failed. They would have been they probably wouldn't even launched it because there would have been so much backlash, or they would have redesigned it completely. So this is a reinvention of the classic rank and file game of Warhammer Fantasy Battles, which I think is the correct move. It's what should be done. That was the biggest change from Warhammer Fantasy Battles to Age of Sigmar, in that it wasn't rank and file anymore. Everything was on round bases, individual models. And I was out of the hobby when Age of Sigmar happened. And when I came back, I'm like, oh, this doesn't feel right. It still feels really odd to me to say we have a Warhammer game, a fantasy Warhammer game, even though this is more like a grimdark fantasy now, that is not regiment, like rank and file. One of the interesting things that I actually do hope they do is they take the Kings of War perspective of having unit bases. So instead of having single models on one base, so you have a unit of, let's say, 20 soldiers, they would be on 20 individual bases and you have to move that around. What you can do with Kings of War, as far as I'm aware, I'm not a big player of the game, but my understanding is you can actually put them all on one base. So you have a base that is the size and the correct scale for 20 individual models, but then you can pose them in different ways. You can put them on terrain. You can do a lot of interesting things, make them all diorama-like. And I've seen a lot of interesting takes on that. I don't know if that's going to happen. Hopefully it's an option because I think that is really interesting. It adds this whole more artistic element to creating your own unit and you can tell narrative within that unit itself. The next big question was, what's the scale going to be? There was this rumor going around and I don't really know where this came from, but it was just reported in a whole bunch of locations that it was going to be 10 or 15mm scale. So basically this would have been War Master. No, they're saying, what? No, what madness is that? It's going to be 28 to 32mm scale. And they specifically said, we want people to be able to use their old armies if they wish, or to add new miniatures to old armies, whatever they want. And that just is a logical, common sense decision. As much as I want the 10-15mm scale models, and eventually we will get that for Epic 40k, and hopefully one day in the future we will get War Master again in some form, it had to be 28mm. For me personally, I don't think it wouldn't bother me either way. I think 15mm scale would be awesome. At 28mm, it makes sense. So next up, we're going on to the rules. So the question is totally new or 8th edition? It's totally new, but it's taking a lot from what they're saying 3rd to 8th edition, where you consider 1st and 2nd edition were more like role-playing. 3rd to 8th was the more rank and file that you'd be familiar with. So they're taking a lot of those, I won't say elements, but we'll say inspiration and creating a new game. It could be like a 9th edition, essentially, possibly. We don't know yet, but I think it's going to keep a lot of those elements. It may have a completely different stat line for the units or the individual units. Who knows? We don't know. The most important question, and I'm surprised they didn't leave this to the end, is it Orcs or Orcs? It's Orcs. Yeah, it's because they were called Orcs back then. So we're going to call them Orcs. From an IP perspective, which is the reason why they changed Orcs to Oryx, so they could actually have ownership over that name. Going back to Orcs makes sense because we have to consider that this is a world that existed before the end times and we know about it already, and they're called Orcs. You can't retroactively just change their name. Games Workshop have retconned a lot of stuff. Lore and things change over time. You know, I'm glad that they're going for Orcs. It's such a simple thing. It's just the name or something, but I think it would cause a pretty big uproar. Then we go on to the setting. Everyone was asking, well, what happens because the end times happened? It's set several hundred years before the end times. So it's a space that's separate to all of that and what Warhammer Fantasy Battles was. So that's going to be a way for them to explore things that they couldn't explore before. There is a lot of lore set up for that, like things that have happened, names of people, names of places and events, but it wasn't as explored as much as Warhammer Fantasy Battles and Age of Sigmar has been. So they got that play area. And then they go on to bases. Are they sure they're going to be square? And like, yes, they're going to be square. So I think it's pretty clear they're going to be square. And honestly, it doesn't affect design too much. It does a bit in that because it's rank and file, the bases do have to match up and sit flush next to each other. So you don't want to have a model that hangs out over the base completely and then, you know, have to squish them all together. Getting around that would be having unit bases. I hope that that is an option, but that's just my own personal preference, simply because, like I said, you can create these awesome looking narrative bases. And finally, they're talking about the release date, when it's coming out. We don't know. They're saying it's going to be quite some time yet because they're still working on the game. I've seen a lot of concept art, so there probably is models made, possibly ready to go. They might not have any molds made for them yet. We just don't know. It's still going to be a while away. I don't think this is going to be out next year. I think possibly 2023. So many things that we don't know. This article does clear up a lot of the questions. All of these were sort of assumed, like they were going to be square bases. If it was not square bases, there was going to be a riot. It was going to be 28 mil. A new rule set makes sense. Release date, we don't know. Let me know if you're interested in seeing some more old world coverage, and you can do that by hitting the like button and leaving a comment. And if you do that, it does help out the video because YouTube likes that kind of interaction. So I'm out of here for now. I will see you in another video. Catch you later.